Hello again, Internet. Welcome to another episode of this video show. Um, Today, in this video, I'm going to talk about some uneasy truths about the Israel war. So, over the last 24 hours, it's been confirmed that some more hostages were released. About 10 Israelis, including one who was also an American. Several Thai workers who had been kidnapped and held hostage, and a couple of Russian citizens as well, which was seen as some kind of a nod to Putin by the Hamas. And in addition to that, it was announced by Hamas that the little 10-month-old baby, he was 8 months old when he was kidnapped, and his sibling and his mother, basically the whole family, all the family members that had been kidnapped from that family have been killed. That's about as barbaric as you can be. People want to deny the barbarism of the Hamas. I want to compare what Israel is doing in response as somehow as bad or worse. They don't just lack a moral compass. They lack a clear understanding, comprehension of what's actually happening. It is not at all comparable to say that Israel is intentionally targeting civilians. It's just utter nonsense. If you've ever met anybody who's been in the IDF and has told you about what they're trained to do, one of the most important orders that they receive is to not harm civilians. It's to protect civilian life. Of course, that does not mean, hey puppy, hey buddy. That does not mean that bad things don't happen. Because war is hell, and terrible things happen. And it is awful every single time a civilian dies, no matter what people group they happen to be a member of. The difference between the Hamas and Israel, or the Hamas and the IDF specifically, is that the Hamas intentionally targets innocent civilians. Civilians. Intentionally. That is their goal. That is their aim. That is who their targets are. The fact that they happen to kill or capture Israeli soldiers on October 7th was almost by the by. If there had not been a military base where it was, they would not have gone on to pursue another one. They would have just gone to another civilian village. And they went to many civilian villages, kibbutzim and other types of villages near Gaza, where, not ironically, because they knew it, most of those people are on the left wing of the Israeli political spectrum, and are in fact advocates of peace and coexistence with the very Palestinians who live in Gaza, many of whom worked in their kibbutzes and used their freedom of movement in those kibbutzes and villages to gather intel on the villages and the individual residents and their homes and the structures, and they gave that intel to Hamas. So when people tell me, or when people say that this war is just between Israel and Hamas, it's a bit of a joke, because it's not as if Hamas is only the armed wing of Hamas. That is to say, the men with the guns and the rockets and the bombs and all those other things. There are a lot of people among the Palestinian population in Gaza and in the West Bank who fully support the armed terrorists of Hamas. Now, of course, that isn't to say that all of the Palestinians support them. In fact, we know that that's not the case. Yes, it may be a large percentage that do support them. It may even be the majority, which would be a sad fact if true. Very well be the case. Unfortunately, there are no real independent polling companies operating regularly in Gaza. Those do surveys there is usually beheld or beholden to an agenda, whether their own or that of the Hamas, incarcerated, beaten on the other side of the gun. And by that I mean on the wrong end of it. Or the lethal end of it, anyway. And what does this tell me? Well, it tells me that there's really no actual valid statistics coming out of Gaza in terms of the number of people who actually support Hamas, or even the number of dead and injured, although it's clearly a fairly high number, very likely in the thousands. How many thousands, we don't know. How many of them are Hamas fighters, we don't know. There's no shortage of videos that show people in Gaza, putting ketchup on people to pretend that they're wounded in order to prop up the numbers of wounded and people being put in body bags or, wrapped in white cloth to pretend that they're dead. Which is insane, because you shouldn't have to fake that in the first place. There's certainly enough people dying that the real numbers would be devastating enough and terrible enough if you are on the side that is anti-Israel and wants to see an end of the violence and blames everything on Israel, even though they were attacked on October 7th in a brutal series of attacks by the barbaric terrorists of the Hamas. Let's not, what they did was absolutely awful. Nevertheless, there are a fair number of people among the Palestinians in Gaza who wish that the Israelis would actually be in charge again. And they're not all collaborators with Israel. Even if they made their money in Israel, or even if they didn't, they recognize that when Israel, quote-unquote, occupied Gaza, they had a better quality of life. The Israelis did not generally interfere with the day-to-day lives of the average Palestinian. The Hamas does that all the time. They don't allow women to be free or have equal rights. They obviously are anti-LGBTQIA+. They don't allow for political freedom of speech or any kind of freedom of expression. You have to toe the party line, or it's a potential long prison sentence or even a death sentence. And when people say Israel is a colonizer, what exactly are they colonizing? Israel has not occupied Gaza since 2005. Not a single Israeli has been alive there other than hostages or soldiers who had to go in and rescue or stop fighting since 2005. And when people say, well, Israel controls the ports and the fuel and the energy and the water and the food and other supplies into Gaza, well, if the people of Gaza had demanded that Hamas spend the billions that they received in aid every year on building infrastructure and a better life, well, then there'd be a better life, and they'd have their own food and water and fuel, etc. And they wouldn't be launching rockets at Israel, and all these wars and all these unfortunate, terrible deaths would not have happened. So, anyway, those are just some thoughts about some truths that are uneasy for a lot of people, regardless of what side they're on, especially those who are anti-Israel and who, for whatever reason, believe that Israel should permanently cease fire against Hamas, which is an interesting thing because when the war on terror began after the attacks of 9/11 in New York and Washington, D.C., nobody demanded that the United States declare a ceasefire when it was annihilating Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. And by the way, killing many thousands of civilians. The war lasted 20 years there, or more, and cost hundreds of thousands of lives, of which a fair share, if not more than half, were civilians. There were no marches to demand that the Americans stop doing what they were doing. It was understood that Al-Qaeda had to be stopped, and that Afghanistan was a nation worth saving from that horrible group of people, the Taliban, and the Al-Qaeda terror network that found a base there. And eventually, the Americans made the decision to leave Afghanistan without finishing the job of setting up Afghanistan as a proper democracy. Try though it did, it failed because of many other reasons, including the massive corruption that was pervasive in the Afghan government, and which had decided that rather than fight the Taliban, they would essentially collaborate with them to try to find a way forward, and America would leave. And by doing that, they incentivized other terror groups around the world to do more of the same. And that's exactly why we saw what happened on October 7th. And hopefully Israel will have learned from this and make a more intelligent and wiser decision in order to prosecute this war until the end, until it meets its goals. However, I do not believe that Israel's stated goals will actually happen the way that they've initially declared. Prime Minister certainly will not do exactly what he said. He himself has waffled a lot back and forth, trying to dance a delicate dance and walk a fine line between prosecuting the war and also appeasing America. But all the same, it is a very dangerous set of circumstances, and we are not nearly at the end of this war, because in all likelihood this will continue and become a lot bloodier as Israel moves into South Gaza. Anyway, I wish you all well. I'll talk about this more later. Bye.